The library at Ashford Park had not been entered in 3 years. The servants knew this. They knew it, the way they knew everything about the Duke, not from being told, but from watching, from the particular quality of silence that had settled over the East Wing after Lady Ashford's funeral, from the way the groundskeeper had stopped trimming the rose arbor that faced those windows, from the fact that Mrs. Holt, who had served the Ashford family for 22 years, still dusted the brass handles of those doors every Tuesday morning, but never turned them. So when the letter arrived from London, from a Miss Emmeline Voss, cataloguing specialist, recommended by the Royal Society's librarian himself, Mrs. Holt had read it twice before she dared bring it to his Grace. She had expected him to refuse. He had not refused. He had said Tuesday and returned to his papers, and that had been the entirety of the conversation. Emmeline arrived on a Tuesday, which she would later think was either a coincidence or a sign, depending on what kind of person she was feeling like at the time. She came by hired coach with 2 trunks, one for her clothes and one for her tools. Acid-free paper, cataloguing ledgers, brushes for dust, a magnifying glass her father had left her, the only inheritance that had mattered. She was 26 years old. She had catalogued 11 private libraries in 4 years, and she had learned to read a room's emotional temperature before she read a single spine. Ashford Park's temperature was grief, carefully maintained. The housekeeper met her at the door with the warmth of a woman who had been waiting for something to do. Mrs. Holt was small and white-haired, and had the particular efficiency of someone who ran a household of 15 for a man who occupied approximately 3 rooms of a 40-room estate. She showed Emmeline to her quarters, comfortable, south-facing, a small fire already lit, and then she showed her the library. She opened the doors, and Emmeline stopped breathing for a moment. It was enormous, 2 stories of shelved volumes behind a gallery, with an iron railing, a rolling ladder on brass tracks, 3 fireplaces, and windows that faced the park on one side and the kitchen garden on the other. The morning light came through the east windows in long, pale columns and landed on dust that had not been disturbed in years. The smell was extraordinary, old paper and leather and something faintly mineral, like the inside of a stone church. His Grace's father collected extensively, Mrs. Holt said, and his grandfather before him, the current Duke, added considerably in his 20s. A pause. Before. Emmeline understood what before meant. She did not ask. "He knows I'm here," she said instead. "He approved your appointment himself. But does he know I'm here, today, in this room?" Mrs. Holt folded her hands. His Grace is aware of all that occurs in his household, which was not, Emmeline noted, an answer to the question she had actually asked. She set her trunk down on the long central table, opened her first ledger, and began. The Duke did not appear that week, or the next. She saw evidence of him. A decanter moved, a newspaper folded differently than she had left it on the hall table, a pair of muddy boots outside the side entrance that the footman collected, with the practiced speed of someone accustomed to invisibility. Once, at 5:30 in the morning, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the library and held very still. But they did not stop. She was not sure if she was relieved or disappointed. She catalogued. She found a first edition of Paradise Lost behind 3 volumes of agricultural surveys, which was either an accident or a statement. She found a collection of Italian poetry with marginalia in 2 different hands, one careful and academic, one sprawling and argumentative, and spent longer than was strictly professional reading the argument in the margins. She found a locked cabinet in the northeast corner that Mrs. Holt, when asked, said contained His Grace's personal acquisitions, and produced a key without being asked twice. The cabinet held philosophy, Hume, Locke, Rousseau, Wollstonecraft, and tucked behind the Wollstonecraft, as if it had been hidden there by someone who did not want to explain it, a battered copy of a novel she recognized immediately. A love story, famous in certain circles, the kind of book that a man who wished to be thought coldly rational would not want discovered. She catalogued it without comment, but she did not put it in the locked cabinet when she returned it. She put it on the shelf with the other novels, in its proper alphabetical place, where it had always belonged. She had been at Ashford Park for 3 weeks when the Duke finally appeared. She did not hear him come in. That was the first thing she noticed later, that a man of his size moved with remarkable quiet. She was on the gallery, kneeling on the floor, with a ledger balanced on her knee and 3 volumes stacked beside her, when she became aware that the quality of the silence below had changed. She looked down through the iron railing. He was standing in the center of the library, looking up at the shelves. She had been given a description. 34, dark-haired, tall, the kind of face that had been called handsome so many times it had stopped meaning anything. The description was accurate and entirely inadequate. What it had not conveyed was the stillness of him. He stood in the middle of the room like a man who had forgotten how to be in it, like someone returning to a place after a long absence and finding it simultaneously exactly the same and completely unrecognizable. His eyes moved along the shelves. Then they moved to the ledger she had left open on the central table, the one with her handwriting in it. 3 weeks of careful notation. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up. He found her immediately, which startled her. She had not moved, had made no sound, but his eyes went directly to the gallery, directly to the section of railing she was kneeling behind, as if he had known she was there all along. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was low and carried easily in the high-ceilinged room. "Your Grace," she said. A pause. Neither of them moved. "How is it progressing?" he said. "Well, you have approximately 4,000 volumes, which is a conservative estimate. I've completed the east wall of the ground floor and the northeast corner cabinet." Another pause. "I found a first edition of Paradise Lost behind some agricultural surveys. I've noted it in the ledger." Something moved across his expression. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one, perhaps. The memory of an expression that had once been easy and was now effortful. "My father," he said, "believed that beauty should be hidden behind utility. He applied the principle to most things." She considered this. "That seems like a philosophy with significant drawbacks." The almost smile again. It had several. He looked at her for another moment, assessing, she thought, though she couldn't determine what criteria he was applying. And then he turned and walked out. The doors did not slam. They closed with the same careful quiet with which he had arrived. Emmeline looked down at her ledger. She wrote, 3rd week, first conversation, 4 sentences. She was not sure why she wrote it. She told herself it was professional notation. She did not entirely believe herself. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He did not speak much. He would arrive, always in the late morning, always with the same quality of quiet, and he would take a book from the shelf, or sometimes simply stand looking at the shelves, and he would stay for an hour, sometimes 2, before leaving without announcement. He did not ask her to stop working. He did not acknowledge her presence beyond the occasional nod. But he kept returning to the same room where she was, which Emmeline had learned, in 26 years of paying close attention to people, was its own kind of communication. On the 5th day, he sat down, not at a distance, at the central table, 6 feet from where she was working, in the chair that faced the window. He opened a book. She noted the spine, Marcus Aurelius, and he read. She catalogued. The fire crackled. Outside, the kitchen garden showed the first pale green of early spring. An hour passed, and then another, and neither of them spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of two people who have independently decided that the other's presence is tolerable, which is, Emmeline thought, a more honest foundation than most. "You move the Wollstonecraft home," he said. She looked up. He was still looking at his book. "I did," she said. "It belongs with the other works of political philosophy. The locked cabinet seemed to be functioning as a sort of exile." A pause. "It was my wife's." Emmeline set down her pen. "I didn't know. I can return it." "No." He turned a page. She would have found the exile irritating. She had strong opinions about the proper organization of ideas. Another pause, longer. About most things. Emmeline said nothing. She had learned, in 11 libraries, that silence was sometimes the most useful tool she had. She was the one who read the novel, he said, behind the philosophy, in case you were wondering. "I wasn't going to ask." "I know." He finally looked up from his book. His eyes were gray. She had not been close enough before to determine the exact color, and now that she could, she found it was a more interesting gray than she had expected. Not flat, layered. "You're very careful about what you ask. I find that people tell you more when you don't." Something shifted in his expression, not the almost smile this time. Something more considered. "Yes," he said. "I've noticed that too." He returned to his book. She returned to her ledger. She wrote nothing in the margins that day. But she thought about what he had said for a long time afterward. The days developed a shape. He arrived in the late morning. He sat at the central table or in the leather chair by the east window, depending on some internal calculus she couldn't fully decode. He read, or appeared to read, or sometimes simply sat with a book open in his hands while he looked at the middle distance. She catalogued. They spoke occasionally, about the books at first, and then about other things, and then sometimes about nothing at all, which required a particular kind of trust that Emmeline had not expected to develop this quickly. She learned things about him the way she learned things about libraries, not by asking directly, but by paying attention to what was present and what was conspicuously absent. He had read everything in this room, not cursorily. She could tell by the way his hands found spines without looking, the way he sometimes quoted without citing, the way he would occasionally say, "There's a better argument 3 shelves to your left," and be exactly right. He had been educated ferociously, and had continued educating himself long after there was anyone to notice. He spoke 4 languages that she had identified, and possibly more. He had not left the estate in, she did not know how long. She did not ask. He learned things about her, too. She was aware of this, of the quality of attention he brought to their conversations, the way he remembered things she had said 3 days ago and returned to them. He noticed when she was frustrated. She had a habit, she gathered, of pressing her lips together when a volume was misdated, and he noticed when she was pleased, which was harder to read but apparently not impossible for him. "You found something," he said one morning, without looking up from his book. She was on the gallery, and she had not made a sound. "How did you know that?" "You've stopped moving." He turned a page. "You stop moving when you find something that interests you. You've been still for 4 minutes." She looked down at the volume in her hands. It was a hand-annotated star atlas, mid-17th century, with observations in a cramped and passionate hand that she was fairly certain belonged to someone important. "It's a star atlas," she said. "The annotations, I think they might be Flamsteed's." He was silent for a moment. Then he set down his book and stood up. He came up the gallery stairs. She heard his footsteps on the iron and crossed to where she was standing. He was taller than she had registered from below. He stopped beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, and held out his hand. She gave him the atlas. He opened it. He looked at the cramped, passionate annotations for a long time. Something moved across his face that she had not seen before. Something unguarded, something that looked almost like wonder. "My grandfather acquired this in 1743, he said. "He never knew what it was. Or he did, and he didn't tell anyone." He looked at her, up close. His eyes were more complicated than she had managed to see from across the room. The layered gray had something underneath it, something that had been carefully covered and was becoming, incrementally, less covered. "You think he was hiding it?" "I think people hide things they love. In my experience." She paused. "Libraries are full of it." He looked at the atlas again. "Yes," he said quietly. "They are." He stayed on the gallery for the rest of the morning. They worked side by side, she cataloging, he reading the Flamsteed annotations aloud in a low voice, translating the Latin without being asked, occasionally stopping to argue with an observation made 300 years ago by a dead astronomer. She found to her surprise that she argued back. She had not expected to. She was not generally someone who argued with dukes, but he did not seem to want someone who didn't. The evening it rained was the evening everything changed. She had stayed later than usual. There was a section of manuscripts that required more careful handling than she had anticipated, and she had lost track of time in the way that only happened when she was genuinely absorbed. When she finally looked up, the windows were dark, and the fire had burned low, and the rain was hitting the glass in long diagonal sheets. She heard him before she saw him. The library door opened, and he appeared with a lamp, and he stopped when he saw her still at the table. "I thought you'd gone," he said. "I lost track of the time." She looked at the window. "I apologize. I'll go now." The east corridor floods when it rains like this. He set the lamp on the table. "Mrs. Holt has put you in the south wing. You'll need to go around." He paused. "Or you could wait." She looked at him. He was looking at the window, not at her, and his jaw was set in the particular way she had come to recognize as him being careful about something. "I'll wait," she said. He sat down, not at his usual distance, closer, in the chair across the corner of the table from her, so that if she reached out her hand, she could have touched his. He did not reach for a book. He looked at the fire. She set down her pen. She looked at the fire, too. "You were here when she died," she said. It was not a question. She had not planned to say it. He was quiet for a long time. "Yes." "In this room?" "In this room." A pause. She loved it more than any other place in the house. She said it was the only room where she could think without the rest of the world interrupting. He looked at the shelves. "I couldn't come back in. After. For a long time I thought I would simply leave it, seal it off, let someone else deal with it eventually. But you didn't. I didn't." He looked at his hands. "I'm not sure why I wrote to the society. It seemed like it was time, or it seemed like something she would have told me to do, which is not quite the same thing." Emmeline said, "How long has it been?" 3 years. He said it simply, without the careful management she had expected. 3 years, 4 months, and he stopped. I don't count the days anymore. I used to. Something tightened in her chest. She said, I lost my father 4 years ago. He was a bookseller. I used to count the days, too. He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he had looked at the Flamsteed Atlas, with that unguarded quality that seemed to surface only when he encountered something he had not expected and did not have a prepared response to. I'm sorry, he said. And I am sorry, she said. Truly. The fire crackled. The rain intensified against the glass, and then slowly began to ease. The novel, he said. Behind the philosophy. She put it there herself. She said she was embarrassed to be seen reading it. A sound that was almost a laugh. She wasn't embarrassed by anything. I think she just liked having a secret. Everyone should have at least one, Emmeline said. What's yours? She had not expected him to ask. She looked at him. The careful gray eyes, the jaw that had relaxed, the man who had spent 3 years in a house full of books and silence and was only now beginning to speak again. And she said, I talk to the books. When I'm cataloging alone, I narrate what I'm finding. It helps me think. He was quiet for a moment. What do you say to them? Whatever they seem to need to hear. She paused. Your library needed to hear that it was extraordinary, so I told it that. Something happened to his face then. Not the almost smile, not the guarded wonder. Something more open than either. Something that looked like the beginning of a thing he had not felt in a long time. It is extraordinary, he said. She chose most of it. She had excellent taste. She did. He looked at the shelves. In most things. The rain had stopped. The fire had burned to embers. Neither of them moved for a long moment, and the silence between them was different from all the previous silences. Warmer, more weighted, carrying the particular charge of 2 people who have told each other true things and are now sitting in the aftermath. I should go, she said finally. Yes, he said. He did not move. She gathered her things. She was at the door when he said, Miss Voss. She turned. Thank you, he said. For... He stopped, started again. For talking to it. The library, it's been quiet for a long time. She looked at him across the room. The lamplit shelves behind him. The dying fire. The man who had been living in 3 rooms of a 40-room house and was only now, tentatively, beginning to occupy more of the space available to him. I'll be here tomorrow, she said. He nodded. I know. She left. She did not look back, but she was smiling before she reached the corridor, and she did not entirely understand why, and she did not try very hard to. The weeks that followed had a different quality from the first ones. He began to arrive earlier. She began to stay later. The library, which had been a place of careful professional distance, became something else, a shared space with its own domestic rhythms. Mrs. Holt, who missed nothing, began sending tea at 11 without being asked, 2 cups, and did not comment on this adjustment. The footman who tended the fires learned that the east fireplace should be lit by 9, because Miss Voss arrived by 9:30 and His Grace arrived by 10, and the room should be warm. They read aloud to each other. This began accidentally. She had been puzzling over a passage in a damaged manuscript and read it aloud without thinking, and he had answered without looking up, and somehow this became a pattern. He read philosophy and argued with it. She read poetry and refused to argue on the grounds that arguing with poetry was a category error. He said this was a convenient position for someone who kept losing the philosophical arguments. She said she was not losing. She was declining to engage on his terms. He said, That was the same thing. She said it absolutely was not. She had not, she realized, argued like this with anyone in years. She had not known she missed it. He showed her the locked room. It was on the second floor of the east wing, the wing that had been closed, the one the groundskeeper didn't look at. He took her there on a morning in late April, with no explanation beyond, "There's something you should catalog," and unlocked the door with a key he carried on his watch chain. It was a study, smaller than the library, but with the same quality of accumulated love, books on every surface, a writing desk covered in papers, a window that faced the rose arbor. A woman's room, clearly, the kind of room that still held the shape of its occupant. He stood in the doorway and did not come in. Her research, he said. She was writing a history of women astronomers. She had been working on it for 6 years. He paused. It's not finished. Emmeline stood in the center of the room and looked at the papers on the desk. 6 years of work. A voice that had been stopped mid-sentence. "I can catalog it," she said carefully. "Preserve the organization. Note where it was in progress." She turned to look at him. "But I think someone should finish it, eventually. When the time is right." He was looking at the desk. His jaw was set, but his eyes were not closed off the way they had been when she first arrived. They were open, hurting, but open. She would have wanted that. Then it should happen. He nodded once. He did not come into the room, but he did not leave either. He stood in the doorway for a long time, and Emmeline worked quietly around him. And when she finally looked up, she found him watching her with an expression she did not immediately have a name for. She named it later, in her own room, with the lamp turned low. It was the expression of someone who had been alone for a very long time and had just realized, with equal parts terror and relief, that they were not alone anymore. The ball was Lady Whitmore's in the village, and Emmeline had no intention of attending. She was not a guest of Ashford Park in any social sense. She was an employee, a professional, and the distinction mattered. She had a dress that would do for the occasion, but she had not been invited, and she had not expected to be, and she was entirely comfortable remaining in the library with a pot of tea and the 16th century manuscripts. He appeared in the doorway at 7:30. He was dressed for an evening out, dark coat, white cravat, the whole formal architecture of a duke in public. And he looked, she thought, deeply uncomfortable, in the way of a man wearing clothes that no longer felt like his own. "I've been invited," he said. "I know," Mrs. Holt mentioned it. "I haven't attended anything in—" He stopped. "I haven't attended anything." "No," she agreed. He looked at her. "I thought I might go." "That seems like a reasonable decision." A pause. "I thought you might come." She set down her pen. She looked at him very carefully, because she wanted to be sure she understood what he was asking and what he was not asking, and whether those were the same thing or different things. "I'm not a guest," she said. "St. You would be if I invited you. Dukes don't escort their librarians to village balls. I'm not aware of a rule specifically prohibiting it." He held her gaze. "I find that I don't want to go without. I find that I don't want to go alone." She had learned, in weeks of careful listening, to pay attention to where he stopped and started again, to what he had been going to say and what he said instead. She stood up. "Give me 20 minutes, she said. The dress she had was blue. Not the blue she would have chosen if she had been choosing, but a good blue, honest and clear. And when she came down the stairs and found him waiting in the hall, she saw him look at her the way he had looked at the Flamsteed Atlas, with that unguarded quality, with something underneath the careful gray that she was no longer pretending she didn't notice. "You look," he said, and stopped. "20 minutes," she said, as promised. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not the ghost of a smile, an actual one, brief, real, and startling in its warmth. "Exactly as promised," he said. Lady Whitmore's ball was the kind of event that had not expected the Duke of Ashford to appear, and the room made this clear in the way that rooms do, a collective intake of breath, a ripple of whispers, the particular recalibration of a social gathering that has just been required to revise its understanding of the evening. He walked in with his hand at the small of her back, and she felt the attention of the room like a physical thing, and she lifted her chin and kept walking. He danced with her once. The waltz was late in the evening, when the candles had burned lower, and the air had the particular warmth of a room that has been full of people for several hours. He held out his hand, and she took it, and they moved onto the floor, and the thing that she had been carefully not naming for weeks became, in the space of 4 bars of music, impossible to keep unnamed. He danced the way he moved through the library, with that quiet precision, that absolute attention. His hand at her waist was careful and certain. His eyes did not leave her face. "You're thinking very loudly, Constauto," he said. "I'm thinking quietly. You're just paying very close attention." "Yes," he said. "I am." The music turned. He drew her slightly closer, not improperly, but noticeably, and she felt the shift in her chest the way she had felt the first morning she had walked into his library, like standing in a doorway of something enormous and realizing she was about to go in. "I haven't danced in 3 years," he said. "You're doing well. I had an excellent reason to remember how." He said it quietly, with the same directness he brought to everything, and she felt her breath catch in a way she did not try to hide. They did not speak again until the music ended. He brought her a glass of something cool, and they stood near the window, and he said, in a voice that was very low and very even, "I don't know what this is. I want to be honest with you about that. I know what it was. I know what I had. I'm not certain I know how to." He stopped, started again. "But I know that when I walk into the library in the morning and you're already there, something settles, something that has not settled in a very long time." Emmeline looked at him. The candlelight was doing something complicated to his face, softening the careful lines of it, making visible the things he usually kept behind the composure. "I know," she said. "I feel it too." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Good." Just that. Good. They returned to Ashford Park at midnight, and he walked her to the library door. Not her room, the library, because they both understood that was the room that was theirs. And he stopped outside it. "I meant to tell you something," he said, "about the library." "Tell me." "When I was 22, I spent a summer cataloging it myself. I got through approximately 300 volumes before I gave up and decided I needed to marry someone who could help me finish it." A pause. She laughed at me for that. She said it was the least romantic reason for a proposal she had ever heard. Emmeline looked at him. "Was it the real reason?" "No," he said, "but it was the reason I could say out loud." She understood this perfectly. She understood it the way she understood everything about him, not because he explained himself, but because she had been paying attention. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. "Good night, Miss Voss." She went inside. She stood in the dark library for a moment, with the moonlight coming through the east windows and falling across the shelves, and she thought about the Flamsteed Atlas and the novel behind the philosophy, and the 6 years of unfinished work in the room upstairs, and she thought about the way something settles, and the way that settling can feel after a long time of things not settling, like the most extraordinary thing in the world. She was still there when she heard his footsteps stop outside the door. He did not come in, but he did not leave for a long time. The letter from his family arrived on a Thursday. She did not know its contents. That was not her business, but she knew something had shifted because he came to the library that morning and did not sit down. He stood at the window and looked at the park, and the careful stillness of him had a different quality. Tighter, more defended. "My mother," he said without turning around, "wishes me to attend the family gathering in June in London." A pause. "She has taken the liberty of identifying several young women she considers suitable." Emmeline set down her pen. "I see." He turned then. His eyes found hers immediately, the way they always did. "I wanted you to know, before you heard it from someone else." "Why would I hear it from someone else?" "Because Mrs. Holt knows everything and tells you more than she realizes." Something moved in his expression. "I'm not going to London." "You don't have to explain that to me." "I know I don't have to." He crossed the room, and he stopped at the table, and he looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand was his version of courage. This man who had been brave enough to come back into this room, to sit down, to stay. "I want to explain it to you. There's a difference." She met his eyes. "Then explain it." "I'm not going to London," he said. Because there is nothing in London that I want. What I want is here, in this library, working beside me and arguing with me and talking to the books when she thinks no one is listening." His voice was very steady and very quiet. "I am aware that this is complicated. I am aware that it has not been long enough by most people's reckoning. I am aware that I am a man who spent 3 years not leaving his house, and that this is not a recommendation." A pause. "But I know the difference between habit and choice, and this is a choice." Emmeline looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 11 libraries. She thought about the magnifying glass in her trunk and the ledger with 4 sentences in it, and the way silence could be the most honest language available. She said, "I talked to your library for 3 weeks before you came in. I told it that it was extraordinary. I told it that it deserved to be seen." She paused. "I think I was talking to you." Something cracked open in his expression. The composure, which had been thinning for weeks, which had been becoming something more honest and more frightened and more real, finally gave way entirely. He looked at her the way the house must have looked when she first arrived, like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time and had just carefully begun to breathe. He reached across the table and took her hand. His grip was careful and certain, the way he did everything, and she felt it in her chest like a key turning. "Stay," he said, "not as my librarian. Stay." She looked at their hands. She looked at him. She thought about the way she had walked into this library 6 weeks ago, with her trunk full of tools and her father's magnifying glass, and no expectation of anything except 4,000 volumes and a professional task. "The catalog isn't finished," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not. It will take months more, at least. And the manuscripts in the East Study will require considerable attention, yes." She looked at him. He was watching her with that unguarded quality, that layered gray, that terrible and wonderful openness. "Then I suppose I should stay," she said, "professionally speaking." The smile that crossed his face then was nothing like the almost smile, nothing like the ghost of one. It was full and warm and a little undone, and it changed his face entirely, and she thought, there he is. There is the man who argued with a dead astronomer and hid a love story behind the philosophy and spent 3 years in a house full of books, waiting to find a reason to come back into this room. Professionally speaking, he said. Of course. They were married in September in the library. It was Mrs. Holt's suggestion, offered in the careful tone of a woman who knows she is suggesting something unprecedented and has decided to suggest it anyway. The Duke had looked at Emmeline, and Emmeline had said, yes, obviously, yes. And that had been the entirety of the discussion. The ceremony was small. The household, his mother, who had come from London with the expression of a woman who had expected to disapprove and found, to her considerable surprise, that she could not, a handful of friends who had been patient enough to wait for him to return to the world. The library was full of autumn light and the smell of old paper and the particular warmth of a fire that had been tended with care. He held her hands at the altar that was not an altar. That was simply the central table, cleared of ledgers for the first time. And he said, you told a library it was extraordinary. You told it that it deserved to be seen. I've been trying to find the words to tell you the same thing. He paused. I don't have better words, so I'll use yours. You are extraordinary. You deserve to be seen. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you are. She had promised herself she would not cry. She cried. 2 years later, on a morning in October, Emmeline sat at the central table with a cup of tea that had gone cold and a volume of the completed catalogue open in front of her. From somewhere above her, in the gallery, she could hear small footsteps and the periodic thump of a board book being dropped with great satisfaction. She's going to pull the Flamsteed Atlas, said her husband, from the leather chair by the window, without looking up from his book. She won't reach it. She's taller than you think. She is not. A small triumphant sound from the gallery, followed by the unmistakable sound of a large book being successfully retrieved. Emmeline closed her eyes briefly. I'll go. She won't damage it. She's very careful. A pause. She gets that from you. Emmeline looked at him across the room. The man who had come back into this library and sat down and stayed, who had opened the east wing and lit fires in unused rooms, and learned, slowly and with considerable effort, to occupy the full space of his own life. He was looking at her now with that expression she had named 2 years ago, in a lamplit room, the expression of someone who had been alone for a very long time and was no longer. Tell me again, she said. He set down his book. He knew what she was asking. They had made a ritual of it, this returning to the beginning. You were on the gallery, he said, kneeling on the floor with a ledger on your knee. You had been here for 3 weeks, and you hadn't asked me a single question. I wasn't ready to answer. He paused. I thought, here is someone who understands that some things take time. And then I sat down, he said, and I didn't leave. From the gallery, their daughter made a sound of deep, scholarly satisfaction, having apparently found something interesting in a 300-year-old star atlas. The autumn light came through the east windows in long, pale columns. The fire crackled. The library held them all, the 4,000 volumes, and the completed catalogue and the unfinished history that was, now, being finished, one chapter at a time. And it was warm. It had been quiet for a long time. It was not quiet anymore. Thank you for staying until the very end. Their story began in silence. A man who had stopped speaking, and a woman who understood that some things take time. And it became something neither of them had planned, and both of them had needed. If this found you at the right moment, if something in it settled the way he described, I hope you'll subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss what comes next. There are more stories here, more impossible distances closed, more people finding each other in unexpected rooms. You are the reason these stories exist, and I'm grateful you stayed.